again, dear friends and colleagues. Shall we take a brief moment for everyone to make themselves comfortable and sit down, especially our expert panel, because we need to make sure that they keep our speakers on their toes now, don't we? You never know, we might have some dissenting voices expressed in the next hour or so. We're all sitting? Great. Like I said before, we really want you to send in your questions and your comments. So please familiarize yourself with Slido, that's slido.com, and use the code #2023ETC. There it is, #2023ETC on slido.com. We look forward to your questions because we're talking about a very important issue indeed, at least to me it is, and that is, where is the money going to come from? So we've heard about extremely rapid move in terms of climate policy and lots of money being offered by taxpayers on behalf of their governments, both on both sides of the Atlantic. Things are moving, apparently. But are they? We also hear about a kind of mismatch between ambition and projects that are actually activated. We certainly know, if you live in the developing world, if you look at it from outside Europe and you're in, say, India, you think, what's happened to all the money that's been promised to us a long time ago, but has not made its way to Africa and developing Asia for basic necessary adaptation projects? What's going on? Why is there this mismatch? How can we make sure that the funds promised are dispersed and the projects are initiated and deliver? That's what we're going to discuss in the next panel discussion. Let me introduce you to our very cool panelists. Frank O'Sullivan was actually part of our expert panel earlier, is MD of S2G Ventures. It's a clean investment fund. You can ask him about how they make their investment decisions. And he also has an academic role at MIT. And he's been associated with MIT for a very long time. Egil Matsen, sitting next to him, is former deputy governor of Norges Bank, the Norwegian central bank, and he will soon be returning to academia. Where? Well, right here at NTNU. Good to have you with us, Egil. And joining us live from Oslo is Thina Saltvedt, who's senior advisor of sustainable finance at Nordea and has been described to me as the brightest thing in renewable energy thinking in Norway. So welcome, Thina. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Great. We can hear her. Let's start the conversation. So, Frank, I want to put to you the question that Mette put to us earlier, Mette Bjørndal, which is, what are you waiting for? Why is it that with all this money that's allegedly available and a lot of investor appetite for all things sustainable, that the throughput to actual projects on the ground has been relatively slow?
Yeah. So thank you, Nisha, and thank you for that question. It's a very important one. Let me begin first, though, by I just want to compliment Asgeir and the whole team for bringing this overall event together. It's my first time back since COVID, and this new setting is wonderful. The conversation so far today has been fantastic, and it's just great to be in Trondheim again. So just to your question, so undoubtedly, the topic of the energy transition is very much to the fore in what I'll describe as the capital markets today, the pools of capital that exist around the world looking for something to do. People see this as a vital need, of course, we've been discussing this, and an opportunity to deploy very large volumes of capital. And ultimately, that's key to unlocking all of what we've been discussing today, because it's largely a game of dollars and cents, euros and cents, and very large volumes. So from 30,000 feet, when you look at it, it looks like there's ample appetite and ample resourcing to support the transition. The reality, however, is a little bit different. What we're speaking about is an energy transition rather than a kind of energy status quo. And the way capital markets are structured today, particularly at the infrastructure end, is to support status quo existing solution deployment. So what I mean by that is, there is no problem finding billions of dollars to invest in things like onshore or indeed offshore wind farms, solar farms, and so on. What is much more difficult is to find that type of capital willing to invest in some of the solutions that we've been discussing this morning. The idea of integrated infrastructure that looks to bring renewable energy together with perhaps hydrogen or other green molecule production and so on. That is ultimately, and those are ultimately, projects and solutions that have not yet been proven out at scale, are not de-risked, and the capital markets, though they're saying they're very excited to be in this business, are struggling to dip their toes. And we have to find a way to reduce that risk, and there are a whole host of mechanisms for doing that, of course. In the United States, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act is going to help significantly. Here in Europe, there are other mechanisms being looked at. But be under no illusions, the kind of overall exciting story about lots of money wanting to support the energy transition, it is to a certain extent a bit of a mirage. At a second order, there are a lot of technical issues, there are a lot of risks that exist today and so on, that if we do not overcome, we're not going to be able to make remotely near the progress that we need to.
So there are a lot of risks we need to understand in order to help de-risk these projects and match the investor appetite so that they're comfortable to invest. You might want to ask Frank more about what those are. Do you agree with what he said, that there's plenty of money going into offshore wind? I'm not sure I do, and that's a kind of proven case. You might want to ask him about that in the discussion that follows, okay? I also want to introduce into discussion this idea of how do we make money come to the rest of the world? We've had a discussion, it's all about Europe so far, right? How do we make sure that adaptation funds, which have been promised for decades, actually reach Africa and developing Asia? And let's put that to Thina Saltvedt. That when I say climate finance, what do you think, Thina?
Well, I think you're talking about something very important now. And of course, the report who came out from the United Nations yesterday, the IPCC report, showed us how difficult it is to get money into what we really need to get this green transition. Because what this report talked about was the financing gap. And often you look at it separated into what's going into mitigation, adaptation, and then loss and damage. Well, we have seen so far that the money is starting actually to flow into the mitigation part. And of course, the costs, and I'm sure you talked about this earlier as well, the cost of producing, for example, solar power, also wind power onshore, has gone down sharply for the last 10 years. So the increase in investments we have seen in parts of the world. But of course, we still lack to see the right amount of money moving into also mitigation all around the world. Another part is, of course, the adaptation and loss and damage. And unfortunately, we don't see much money going into these sectors at all, or these areas. And of course, they are all dependent. So what we need to do is to scale up the amount of money going into adaptation and loss and damage, which is so important to actually get this green transition socially also more equal, and of course to manage to reach the climate goal we've set.
Thanks, Thina. So you may want to ask her, how do we do that? Because it's been a stubborn problem. And does she see any signs of hope? What are the positive signs that we can learn and draw from? Egil, Matsen, give us a sense of the long-term money that's available. And you have a particularly good insight, I think, having sat in Norges Bank for so long. How can we unlock long-term funds, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, perhaps the kind of money that's not looking for quite such a demanding return?
Well, I think it's true, as Frank said, that there are actually a lot of institutional investors, at least, that are very seriously interested in engaging and in investing in infrastructure projects for renewable energy or the energy transition. To the extent that some of these investors recently have pulled out of certain prospects and possibilities because there are a lot of money chasing too few projects. So some of the challenges, if you like, on climate finance is on the supply side of interesting projects, certainly in the developed world. Mm-hmm. It might be very different, though, as Thina says, in the developing world, where climate finance and development finance is perhaps hard to distinguish these days. The role of the private and the public sector or the government sector might be also very different in terms of investment in the developed world and in terms of investments in emerging markets or the developed world. It's hard to see, for me at least, that given the risk that is present always by investing in emerging markets or developing markets, that there has to be some type of risk transfer, if you like, from private investors to the governments in developed markets.
So let me ask you to elaborate on that then. And already questions have started coming in, aimed at Frank, but I think it'd be good to hear all your views, which is really, how can you elaborate on how governments could help de-risk clean energy investments, or what you were saying, transfer some of the risk? What does that mean in practice?
Well, it could mean simple things as taking part of the investment. It could mean designing the tax system in a way that we have, for instance, experience in Norway in taking some of the risk of oil and gas companies when they make investment decisions far into the future. And it could also mean that, well, this is perhaps more hypothetical, but look around the world as we speak now, where it seems like the government is taking risk off the back of depositors and lenders to private banks. So with reference also to the previous session, that when the crisis is big enough, the governments in the developing world are prepared to act and are willing to act to take risk off the private sector, as we talk about now.
Well, certainly governments appear to be willing, or central banks seem to be willing to take risks off banks that appear to be struggling, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks. We're having this conversation, after all, with the backdrop of a potential banking crisis. But do you think that attitude would really transfer to getting the energy transition off the ground? Frank?
Yeah, I think there are a few points just to build on what Egil said. So the role of government, there can be a number of different, obviously there are a number of different roles and levers that government can use in this issue. First is absolutely to play a role in conciliatory capital. So actually taking some risk off projects. And, take the United States government, they're absolutely doing that with a variety of things in their IRA package, right? And people are excited. There's a lot of private capital now stepping in saying, great, we'll take the risk now that it has been somewhat mitigated.
And what, to be specific about what exactly the US government is doing in taking the risk?
So the United States government, through the Department of Energy in the US, has an entity called the Loan Program Office. The Loan Program Office is essentially a bank that is willing to make first loss loans. So they will take the first loss in a large-scale project that is moving a kind of a new technology or a new paradigm through its first of a kind or first couple of a kind deployment. That's very compelling. That basically means that private investors can say, hey, we're really interested in the opportunity that, let's say, blue hydrogen or green hydrogen or anything else in that respect offers. We really struggle to do it ourselves today, but if the United States government is stepping in as a legitimate and at-scale partner in this project, sure, we will.
Okay, so let's just stop that there. That's something that we could do here in Europe as well, and it has happened to some extent, has it not? Thina, is this an idea that is taking place in Norway about getting a prototype, as it were, in an industry, the first loss supported by government funding?
I think many of, especially the industrialized countries around the world now, are looking for different solutions to, accelerate investments in developing and in emerging economies, or how to help out, because many of the industrialized countries, of course, have already also signed up that they will create a fund, a climate fund, that should help investing in countries with high risk, so help to de-risk. What we have seen so far, that actually the amount of money going into this climate fund has not really accelerated enough to fill up to the obligations or the promises that was given. So, but I think many different countries are now looking at different solutions to that. You could have guarantees, for example, different kind of guarantees. So you can de-risk companies or projects in, for example, developing countries to try to help attract more private capital next to the public capital. You have different kinds of, also the insurance sector are looking at different ways of using insurance to both de-risk but also to accelerate the development, and different kind of funds. So you could have national funds, but you could also look at more cooperation between different funds to de-risk both private and public funding, and of course cooperation with the multinational development banks. So there are different possibilities. They are looking into how to speed up or scale up this work. But so far, I think still a lot of money goes into mitigation and not particularly adaptation and loss and damage.
Okay, so we'll come back to that specifically, Thina, and make sure that I do return to her to ask her what can we do to make sure that adaptation is not forgotten. But if you don't mind, and forgive me, we're going to return to mitigation for a while. Egil Matsen, is it permissible for large pension funds, for instance, large sovereign wealth funds, public money, to go directly into investing in one-off projects to make sure that technologies get off the ground? Are they allowed to do that?
I think that's at least two questions in one.
Go on, divide them up and answer them both.
The first of it, yes, they are permissible. In fact, many of them are encouraged to do it by their sponsors or their owners. They are encouraged to do it because it fits with long-term investors, this type of infrastructure projects. Their cash flows are around for a long time. If they are successful, they are pretty stable. So, for instance, in the investment environment that we have now, with higher inflation that we've been used to for 25, 30 years, that's also an attractive property potentially.
So can I just interrupt you there for a minute? So it could be that the rules of the fund prohibit investing in, say, an oil and gas major.
Yeah.
Right, holding their shares, whatever. But many of them say that they're interested in accelerating the transition, right? We heard from Equinor today, and there are many others, including Aker here. But they're struggling to raise the money to go into certain areas, for instance, some offshore wind or some hydrogen. So you're saying that a pension fund or a sovereign wealth fund, which might have some strict rules about investing in this,
could be a co-investor.
Could go into a particular project led by Equinor?
Yeah. Absolutely, I think so. Definitely that Equinor and other of the energy majors could have pension funds and others as their co-investors in infrastructure projects, or that be wind or solar or whatever. But I guess this is important to keep in mind in the Norwegian context, if I may, that the Norwegian government is behind many of the type of Norwegian investors that we're talking about. It's the largest shareholder in Equinor. It's obviously the only owner of the sovereign wealth fund. So what you don't want to do as the end investor here, i.e. the Norwegian government, is to have your different entities competing for the same type of projects. That's a complication in the Norwegian context, but in general, I don't see a problem with pension funds or sovereign wealth funds or other long-term investors investing together with energy majors or other specialist firms.
Frank.
I completely agree with all of that. However, I will emphasize, though, that those actors are actually not really mandated or well-suited to do exactly what we need to do today, which is to bring entirely new solutions to the table and de-risk them for scaling. So, and by the way, in addition, if we talk about the Norwegian oil fund specifically, only mandated to invest in public entities, and that's completely reasonable, but a huge amount of the innovation, the necessary innovation and scaling and de-risking goes on in the private equity markets or the private capital markets. And so you need to understand and you need to figure out some mechanism for unlocking that. Just 2 points in addition. First point is, simply de-risking a project is actually not sufficient, right? What we need to do is we need to obviously de-risk some projects, but then put it on a trajectory for real scale and growth from the overall market itself. So there is a role for government in helping to de-risk individual projects, but oftentimes governments have proved to be pretty bad at picking winners and losers in that respect. The other items that are really important, particularly for the next 10, 15 years, at least from my point of view, there are two at least. First is this issue of permitting, social license to operate, etc. There was an outstanding, from Christian, outstanding comment actually, I think with respect to the need for buy-in. We have a huge challenge today in having the sector be viewed as an opportunity for the community writ large. We need to do more to see, or to help communities see that this is something that's good. We need to be cognizant and sensitive to places where it's not good for the community, and we need to work in building support around that. We see a classic example in the US Midwest today, where there is a lot of pushback on solar deployment at scale in prime agricultural land. And people say, well, it's more Republican versus Democrat. It's not true. It's because these communities are farming communities. They're having large solar farms dropped in on top of them, and they're like, where's the benefit? Now, I think going forward, benefits can emerge from things like taking that clean energy, those clean electrons supporting green hydrogen production locally, and that green hydrogen then entering into ammonia production, which is a big industry in that part of the world and so on. And people can get their heads around that, but we haven't got to that point yet. That's the first point. The second point is markets, and this is, we have several economists in the room who love a bit of power market design in their lifetime. We are in a world today, undoubtedly, certainly in the United States, also I would contend in Europe, where the power market paradigm is pretty broken, maybe utterly broken, vis-a-vis the transition. It's very difficult for private entities, whether they're publicly listed or private entities, to come into power markets, have to make a bet on a 30 or 40-year asset, which wind and solar now are, not really knowing what the merchant market is going to look like in 20 years' time, or indeed 5 years' time, owing to price caps being implemented or a revision of the market structure. That is really in the gift of governments to get those paradigms in place. And it's very important because it's very, very difficult for private actors to step in and take on that risk.
And it's also very politically sensitive, though, isn't it? Because you're looking at governments to step in and create stability, which means ultimately it's the citizen that ends up paying for it. Right. And this is a politically difficult issue, isn't it? So Christian has a question for you. Christian Klonkner.
Yes, since you addressed me directly, I would like to hear your view on which role citizen investments play in creating money for the transition, as it can also generate a higher engagement in the transition.
Yeah.
And before Frank answers that, maybe Thina and Egil, you have your own thoughts on this question, which I'll come to. Okay, go, Frank.
So there are many models, and we can't address them all. I think an interesting model that has proved effective from the US perspective, is a concept called community solar. Also various flavors of this, but it basically provides communities with an opportunity to buy into solar produced from a locally situated asset, typically. It might be locally owned in a co-op context. Otherwise, it might be owned by for-profit entities or NGOs. But it has proved very successful and is a growing component of the residential market. And I think what's useful about those is it gets people a little bit closer to this issue, gets them thinking, and begins to drive that buy-in. The second item, at larger scale, is that at least in the United States, we have a structure with respect to, let's say, property taxes and community taxes, which mean that a lot of very poor regions of the country can massively benefit from the taxes that come from development on their lands. That opportunity hasn't been adequately unlocked yet, and we need to work on those things so communities can see those benefits.
Okay, thanks. Thina, your thoughts on that question from Christian about citizen investors?
I think it's a very good idea, but I think, for example, in Norway at the moment, it's you have some legal structures that makes it more difficult. For example, now during the energy crisis in Europe, and energy crisis moved up sharply, many invested in solar power and put solar power on the roof. The challenge is if you produce too much and try to sell it back to the network. And I think we have to look at how the system is structured today. So it's actually possible to produce your own electricity, for example, or energy. And if you want to sell it back to, so the rest of the community can gain on it, because then you could stabilize the total energy system as well.
Egil?
So about citizen finance, it's an intriguing idea, but I don't know about the scale. Again, going back to the previous session, it's an immense scale that is required there, and I'm sure it can help on the margin, as economists say, but I'm not sure if that really changes things in a fundamental way.
Fair point. Question from Jay Edmonds.
Yeah, this is a great panel, and I'm interested in the panel's views about the missing pieces. If you look at, for example, the IRA, the best case you could make is that there's a business model that would get you 40% of the 50% you need by 2030. By 2050, the power sector has to be
producing... Can I just stop you there for a minute, Jay? You get 40% of the funds you need to get? Is that what you mean? What is the 40% of the emissions
reductions?
Okay, thank you.
Which is the goal is 50% by 2030. Net zero by 2050 for the country, but the power sector has to be delivering very substantial net negative emissions. The power sector needs to be removing CO2 from the atmosphere. What's the missing pieces for a business model that will deliver those goods?
Great question. Who wants to start with it?
Frank, of course.
No, you start on that, because I need some time to think about that.
Everyone wants to think about it. I guess Go on, Egil.
We could say, some of the issues that has been touched upon and discussed at this conference is about very basic infrastructure in society. And I'm sure some of these investments that you talk about in the US with the power sector being if you're not a net emitter, what is as you extract CO2 or greenhouse gases. But my point is that the basic infrastructure that has always in advanced societies been financed and advanced by the public sector. It's very hard to see, for me at least, that this can be solely a private business case for financing this type of very basic infrastructure that you need. It could be the power grid that we already have, publicly financed, railways, publicly financed, phone network and so on. So it would be, I'm not saying that, I've already said that I think the private investors would like to participate in some of this. But at the very basic level, it has to be a very pronounced and central role for the government.
Right. But you're just saying that it's not quite big enough, Jay. Frank?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult, honestly, to get there, put it simply. I would agree entirely, though, that the coordinating role of government is important. The United States struggles with this, right? Because the United States is a very fragmented federalist governance structure, which is a challenge. But I think, key enablements around things like utilizing our CCS potential, the sequestration potential, a lot of that is governed, and that needs to be enabled. Those kind of infrastructures, I think, could be built out, and that would help support the opportunity. I think it's very important for the next 4 or 5 years that demonstrably progress is made. The private sector in the United States, at least, coming back and saying, we want more of this, we like this, that's going to be helpful. If this fails, we have a huge problem. So I think next 5 years, 10 years, crucial for really demonstrating and building appetite for that. And then I think political, candidly, pressure emerges for the government to go further to support that. And that's going to be what's required.
Thina, Saltvedt, the question that came from Jay Edmonds was particularly about emissions reductions and mitigation. But let's turn it on its head. What are the missing pieces in terms of actually getting adaptation funds where they need to get to?
Oh, yeah, I think it's for sure quite difficult because if you go into mitigation, you can see the business case is there. If you go to the adaptation side, it's not very easy to actually measure what's the gain out of these investments. As a private investor, you need to show to your owners or who owns a fund, for example, that you're actually going to have a yield on this fund. And for some of the adaptation investments, it's difficult to show that because how do you actually calculate for example, the emissions you have avoided? That is a very complicated. It's a very complicated to actually calculate it, and it's even more complicated to communicate it. So that makes it difficult to attract money to these parts, and therefore, of course, it's much more dependent on public money.
And development finance institutes, I guess. We heard this morning from Daria Taglioni at the World Bank about how the impending change of leadership in the World Bank could actually change its role quite considerably. We're all hoping that, I'm sure, in this room. What are your thoughts on what we can realistically expect from a different kind of leadership and sort of attitude from the World Bank?
I think it's very important that you have organizations like the World Bank who has a much clearer agenda on the climate policy. I think we lack a bit of this long-term strategies from the big organizations, from the big countries around the world. They have to be much more ambitious. Okay, we have, of course, the Paris Agreement, but we have ambitious climate goals as such, but you lack actually to see the policies supporting these strategies. And I think that is why also investors are a bit or are hesitating actually to go into different investments. If you knew for sure that the sitting government will fulfill their plans and move ahead at the appropriate speed to actually reach these agreements, I think you will feel more ease by investing in some of the projects that are not 100% investable yet. But if you are worried that you will change the government within the next 4 years and your investments might not, or the conditions for your investments might change in the short run or medium term, I think you will sit and wait for a while to see that that the rest of the market is moving in the direction you're hoping for.
Yeah, for sure. Let's have another question from Ramtin Sashansi.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to just follow up on a comment that you made, Frank, saying that one of the sources of risk for investment in the power sector is evolution of market design. And I'll agree completely. If we look over the past 20, 25 years, market designs have changed. But it seems to me a lot of the risk is, I mean, if we look at North America, I mean, a lot of the price dynamics have basically been driven by natural gas prices and how they've evolved over the past 10, 15, 20 years. So if you kind of project out into the future, do you really think market design evolution is the bigger source of risk, or is it underlying commodity prices and maybe policy subsidies that are going to play a role?
So it's great. We were just actually discussing this. So I think, just kind of, this is quite a technical issue, but I would say that where we are today is, let's focusing on the electricity sector, zero or near zero marginal cost resources playing a modest increasing role, but we need to transition to them being in the majority in most systems. Our experience thus far with the modest role has been, some of the issues like the duck curve in California and so on, and an issue of balance between economic rent associated with energy prices and capacity payments. And the issue is really a question of capacity assurance on a go-forward basis. Projects on the renewable front have been slightly dislocated from the, let's say, the market itself, owing to targets for clean energy deployment, owing to corporate engagement, owing to PTCs, et cetera, flowing in. But on a go-forward basis, with more of these assets on the system, the challenges of kind of, in the case of gas-driven pricing, the challenges that emerge there are that you'll have more solar eroding the role that gas plays on the margin during peak hours in many systems. Texas is going to be a super interesting example. And it was those peak hours that really paid for everything else. So we're moving to a situation where, with a lot more solar in particular on systems, and in US systems, which tend to be daytime peaking systems, you're seeing more higher priced hours going away, the average pricing in the markets falling, and an inability to recover overall capacity costs emerging. And I really worry about that, because we don't have a fit-for-purpose balance, in the United States at least, between energy pricing and capacity pricing.
So I think he's saying market design is very important, if I understood you right. We have a question that's come in from one of you out there, and it's particularly for Egil, but somebody else might want to pick up as well. And that is, what do you think is the biggest long-term financial pitfall in our great hurry in accelerating the energy transition? Are there pitfalls? What should we be looking out for?
Well, since we're in a hurry, there's being in a hurry is a risk in itself, I guess. So there's a bigger chance of making bad investment decisions than if you can have the liberty of taking a little more time. But I still think that the biggest risk is doing too little, obviously, given the scale of the problem and the reason why we are here over these few days. That there's the urgency of the problem. And the complexity of solving the problem that leads to risk of doing too little, and I guess that has to be the answer to that question.
Another excellent question that's come in, which is, how are increased inflation and interest rates affecting the financing of clean energy projects? Thina?
Well, of course, that will have a big impact because what we have seen now that the cost of producing solar power, wind power, so on, has fallen sharply for the last 10 years. But of course, the financing cost of this project has been very low at these points as well. Now that those are increasing, of course, the competitive position with fossil fuels will look a bit different, of course, and of course that is very important competing with other areas or other energy drivers, or not at least because the investments itself, the volume itself will be less with higher interest rates and higher costs, basically.
Egil, Matsen?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Thina says, but it's also important to think about that the current inflation that we have around the world, basically, or in most places of the world, is driven by energy. So, and higher energy prices in general is good for the energy transition. You need to have higher prices to have some of these energy sources profitable in their own terms. So it's not only a downside to this inflation that we currently have. A general higher inflation and higher interest rates, it's the real rates that matter. So the interest rates adjusted for inflation, and it remains to see how far up
Spoken
those
like
go.
an economist.
Yeah, I love the true banker.
Frank.
I think we're at a very delicate and dangerous point right now with respect to companies in the publicly traded and private sector that have focused on the clean energy story as part of their growth story. We've had a decade, maybe longer, very low interest rates. That has created a narrative around these companies growing their businesses, growing the megawatts under management and so on. Now, people are beginning to look under the sheets to see where is the financial return. And in the rising inflation rate regime that we're in, it's tough. And if these companies struggle, if this effort kind of is halted somewhat, or the momentum is taken out of it, then that's another 5, that's another 10 years lost to the transition. And I worry about this a lot right now. In the US, we see it, very big pressure for offshore wind. A lot of projects were bid in 4 years ago. Now, those projects, candidly, are going to struggle to make sense.
So I have a very, very quick question. So my final question to you, which I've been wrestling with. I read, in some ways, all this change of this climate policy and the dreadful war in Ukraine has accelerated the energy transition, maybe by 5 to 10 years, I read, the experts say. On the other hand, I listen to your conversations and I think, really? Because the finance, is it coming? Is it going to match? So honestly, I want all of you to give me a brief answer. Is the energy transition going faster? Is the climate matching the ambition? Thina, Saltvedt.
You know, for sure, I think the energy transition is moving faster. But what I really lack is the feeling of this climate crisis. We had the corona crisis, and the whole world managed to mobilize within 2 years. We lack this feeling of a global climate crisis that can make us move even faster. So I think, you know, the energy crisis we're seeing now in especially Europe will contribute to push this development faster. And that is because governments are going in there with some, to support the development. And therefore you will have a faster development also of the technology, for example, and implementation.
I sure do hope you're right, Thina. Egil, Matsen.
So I'm a bit conflicted on that. I agree with Thina that I think the stimulus that the horrible war in Ukraine has given to the energy transition is positive for that in itself. On the other hand, the new international situation creates new demand on governments around the world in terms of security policy, in terms of moving supply lines closer to home. So I think the competition for public resources, for tax money, also for green energy will be larger going forward.
Yeah. Frank?
We're definitely not moving fast enough. Governments, there's a lot of rhetoric. I think in some respects, they are not actually helping to catalyze the change fast enough. They also need to move faster. I genuinely believe the money is there, but we need to put the framework in place for it to be successful.
Well, let's make that happen. I hope this discussion has moved us along a little bit. Shall we say a big thank you to our panelists, Frank O'Sullivan, Egil, Matsen, and Thina, Saltvedt in Oslo. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a short half-hour break now, and when we come back, we're going to look at this question which is sort of lurking around the edges of our conversation, is what can all of us do, really, as citizens, as human beings? What can we do to change our own behaviors to make the energy transition that little bit more effective and that little bit closer. See you in half an hour.